Welcome to our Mountain States of Mind webinar. My name is Sean Paige. I handle communications as part of the comms team here at Mountain States Legal Foundation. You can check out all our work and the important policy and legal work and education work we do by visiting our website at mslegal.org. We are a law firm, a public interest law firm, have been around since the 70s and done some very important work on public lands issues, property rights, Second Amendment issues, First Amendment issues, equal protection issues. But the theme that runs through all those things are an abiding faith and belief in the U.S. Constitution. We fight for the underdogs at Mountain States Legal Foundation. A lot of our clients are people who are outgunned and outmuscled by the federal government. We stand with the underdogs and are proud to have been doing it since the 70s. So please check us out when you can. Today's topic is America's wildfire crisis, causes and cure. And it's a large and complex topic, which we'll jump into momentarily. But first, I just want to give participants a formatting guidelines, and then we'll do some guest introductions. Then we'll just go into it because it's a great topic. We'll be an hour long today. We're going to begin with a moderated discussion among experts, and then we're going to open it up to your questions. Let me start with introducing our really outstanding panelists today. I'm fortunate to have all of them participating. They bring a vast amount of knowledge and real world, not just academic or theoretical experience to these issues. Let me start with Myron Ebell. He's the director of Competitive Enterprise Institute's Center for Energy and Environment, which is one of the most effective advocates for free market environmentalism there is. He also chairs the Cooler Heads Coalition, and that's an ad hoc coalition of over 24 nonprofit groups that question global warming dogma and oppose energy rationing policies. Our second outstanding guest today is Karen Budd-Falen. She's the Falen Law Offices. She's back at the Falen Law Offices in Cheyenne, Wyoming, after a 2-year appointment in the Trump administration Department of Interior, where she was Deputy Solicitor for Wildlife and Parks. Joe Reddan is another one of our panelists today. I've known Joe for many years since he was an active Forest Service employee. He's now the principal and owner of Flexelis Forestry LLC here in Durango, Colorado. It's a consulting forestry firm that he established in 2017. He's been in the Forest Service in almost every capacity you can have for 38 years before his retirement. And he was served as the Assistant Director for Forest Products of the Forest Management Directive at the Department of Interior. David McDonald is a Mountain States Legal Foundation attorney who handles a lot of our natural resources. In 2012, he earned his BA in political science from the University of California, Los Angeles. After moving to New York, he attended Columbia University School of Law. Thank you for your patience on that. I'm sorry if I botched any of your bios. Incredibly well-qualified group. So let's get started. I think we're right here again. It's almost like deja vu in the midst of another summer wildfire season here in the West. And has become part of the ritual, it seems. Some people seem to be waking up to the fact that we have a wildfire crisis across the West, although I would argue that, it's been evolving for the last 20 or 30 years, maybe further back, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So perhaps the best way to tackle the topic is in sort of chronologically in 3 phases. How we got here, where things stand today, and where do we go? And what must we do to get ourselves out of this fire trap if we can? I don't think it's hyperbole to call what we're in a crisis, but it shouldn't have sprung on us suddenly. And it's a very slow moving or slow crescendo to this crisis because the early warning signs that this was upon us probably came in the late 80s with the hellacious wildfires that swept through Yellowstone National Park. Alston Chase wrote a great book about that, playing God at Yellowstone. And since then, I became aware of it in the late 90s when, as a journalist in Washington, D.C., I was seeing stuff about wildfire crisis in GAO reports, General Accounting Office reports of all places. You wouldn't think that that would be the place that I would have been alerted to it. So, you know, anyone who's followed this issue, and I know everyone on this panel has known about this for a long time, as have the experts. So, but let me go to Joe Reddan to talk about, because of his vast experience inside the Forest Service bureaucracy, could you kind of set the stage for how we got here, Joe, and what kind of policies led us or practices led us to this point?
Yes, thank you, Sean. Thanks for that great introduction. And, you know, it can go back to many, many decades, but during the late 19th century to early 20th century, when the Forest Service was starting, fires were always prevalent in the forest. And it was the Great Burn of 1910 burned 3 million acres, which is a huge fire. 3 million acres is 500,000 acres larger than Connecticut, and it burned then in 1910. And so after that, in 1911, the Forest Service had the Weeks Act, which established Eastern National Forest and cooperative forestry. And as time went on, the Forest Service started to cut more timber, build more roads into the forest, and with cooperative fire suppression, fires started to ameliorate. But a Auburn University professor, David South, he had done some work in the 1930s. The United States was burning 36 million acres a year. We're not even close to that. We say, well, we have a big fire season now. We got 10 or 11 million acres. And when you look at it, almost half of those acres are in Alaska. So we've done pretty good. But I think, you know, in terms of where we're at today and why we see the changes in fire and so forth, it's a forestry problem. We don't do enough forestry in the forest, especially the federal forest. And in your introduction, you talked about the Park Service in 1988. And the Park Service is basically a preservation type outfit. And the only tool they have to manage forest is fire. And they weren't using fire then. And in the fire season of 1988, burned several million acres in the park. Fast forward to the 1990s, and we have the Clinton administration, which basically was one of the toughest administrations. I would say the worst administration for federal forestry that we've, in my time that we've served here. They cut the timber program from 12 billion board feet to, by 2008, when I came into the national office in Washington, D.C. for the Forest Service, we were under 900 million board feet that we were cutting. Trees come out of the forest in one of two ways, either in a log truck or up in smoke, and we're not cutting enough of these trees, and that's what is driving these fires that we have now. There's no mills anymore because of the cutback in federal timber in most of the 11 western states, where most of the forest land is federally managed and federally owned. So our forests now are ripe for fires. We would still get fires, but they would burn differently if we actually did more active and better forest management. And then that we didn't use fire as like, well, okay, it started out there, so we'll think about it the day after tomorrow and go after it. That doesn't help. A 10 a.m. policy, which was an old Forest Service standard that most of the Forest Service employees used to follow, try to get that fire out by 10 a.m. the next day. And we need to have that kind of diligence in our federal forests.
Some people have almost jokingly blamed Smokey Bear on this because of the kind of policy that he represented, which was stop all fires, even small, modest, natural fire cycle that had always been a part of the ecology from primordial times here in North America. So was it the suppression of fire over the years that allowed these fuels to accumulate to the point where they're so volatile today?
Fire suppression does have a role in what we see today. But poor Smokey, he gets maligned for lots of things. And I actually have a shirt that says, it's a Smokey Bear shirt that maybe I should have worn it today for the conference, but it says only you can stop socialism. And that's a riff on his fire message. But the fact is that forests grow annually, and they grow at geometric rates, and we need to be working those forests to remove fuels. For example, if you were a client and I was a personal trainer, and you came into my office and I said, "Hey, I want to get in shape." I wouldn't start you out with a marathon the next day. I mean, we would do some basic things, and that's what we need to do to reestablish our forestry heritage here in the United States. We need to go in there and actively thin and remove trees with under logging scenarios, not under service contracts, but under actually selling these logs and making sure that there's a marketplace for them. And as we reduce the live tree density, in a few years after that, then we can start to burn, but we should start to burn like in the wintertime when it's cooler and so forth, and not these summertime burns that that you see now where the fires escape. And then Los Alamos fire, the Cerro Grande fire out of Los Alamos, that's a classic escape fire example that was done in May of 2000. In May of 2000, I think, was the year that it was done. And, had disastrous consequences, not only for the Los Alamos nuclear lab, but for the town of Los Alamos. And they're still recovering today from that.
You mentioned the fall off in production or timber harvest or thinning or forest management, whatever you want to call it, during the Clinton years. That was really precipitated by the spotted owl debate and conflict in the Pacific Northwest, which leads us to one of the regulatory factors in here. And again, I invite everybody to chime in, which is the Endangered Species Act. I mean, we have a very complex management regime on public lands that involve a lot of regulations, including ESA and NEPA and those kind of things. Maybe Karen can kind of give us an overview of how those regulatory factors have conspired to, one, create the situation, and also maybe conspiring to get us to trap us in it.
Sure. Well, first, thank you for having me on this panel. When President Trump came into office, one of the things that he ordered us to do was to look at the federal regulations to see how they were impacting businesses as well as the environment. The Endangered Species Act, for example, is an act that mandates that species that are defined as either threatened or listed be protected. And while that is a requirement from Congress, what really is happening is that once species are listed, you have critical habitat designations, such as the one for the northern spotted owl. But what people don't seem to understand is that Congress was very specific, is that once you designate critical habitat, it's not for recovery, and that you don't have to designate critical habitat so long as the species does not go extinct. And I think what happened when they started doing critical habitat designations in the Clinton administration and before, they were confusing what critical habitat was supposed to be used for. People were saying, oh, well, we have to have it. We have to be able to protect stuff in the future. One of the things Obama did was he created a scenario where the critical habitat didn't necessarily have to have all of the features, either breeding, feeding, or sheltering for the species, but it could develop in the future, but they would start regulating that habitat now. And that is absolutely not what Congress intended. Congress intended that critical habitat be the smallest unit possible, so long as the species didn't go extinct. And if you look at the critical habitat for the northern spotted owl, the Fish and Wildlife Service designated a huge amount of acres for critical habitat. But what nobody understood was that was the only thing they designated was habitat that could be logged. Things like wilderness areas, like national parks, like wild and scenic rivers areas, that was not included in the critical habitat designation. Those were all extra designation and extra acres that could be counted. And so that's one of the reasons that the Trump administration settled a lawsuit with the American Forest Products Group to relook at that critical habitat and actually do it correctly under the Endangered Species Act. I think another issue you have is people have misinterpreted NEPA. National Environmental Policy Act does not require that the environment be considered at all costs. NEPA, according to the Supreme Court, is a procedural statute. It directs federal land managers to consider environmental impacts and to make informed decisions and to notify the public about environmental impacts. But there is nowhere in NEPA that says that environmental impacts are more important than economic impacts. That's one of the reasons the Trump administration so revised the definition of impact. And if you look at the new definition of impact, it includes impact on the human environment, which includes jobs, community stability, business stability, local communities, whether they want to build a school or a road or whatever it is they want to build. That's also supposed to be considered as part of NEPA. And so one of the things that I think we really need to do is examine these statutes and understand what Congress really intended. I have a speech that I often give called "What Happens When Good Laws Go Bad?" And I think that many of these acts, and Congress started out with good intentions, but they write acts so that you can interpret them in 1,000,007 different ways. The courts then simply accept the interpretation of the federal agencies without going back and really looking at the congressional record, at congressional hearings, and understand what Congress really intended. And if you consider our Constitution, it's Congress that's supposed to write the laws, and we're supposed to implement the intent of Congress, not just regulations on top of regulations on top of regulations.
I saw you nodding your head on the topic of NEPA, David. Did you want to chime in on the regulatory thicket that is out there in terms of that impedes our ability, if it does, to actually get a handle on these things or to manage these forests in a responsible way?
Yeah, sure. So I think NEPA really is at the absolute center of this problem, because NEPA is really the thing that prevents any of the other solutions that people may want to come up with. NEPA is the thing that frustrates that. Under your best case scenario, under ideal circumstances, nothing goes wrong, no one protests your project, you're looking at what, 2 years minimum? Is that, yeah, the other people nodding their heads. That's under ideal circumstances to try to get some sort of forest reconstruction project done. And it can get significantly worse. You see, I think the Property Environmental Research Center, PERC, has their report from April this year, which is really great. It's about 40 pages. Everyone should read it. I think it's freely available. But they talk about a story up in Bozeman, Montana, where they're trying to do a forest restoration project. Started in 2004, has been approved twice, but 2 separate ESA listings halfway in the middle of that, combined with extensive NEPA review and environmentalists getting involved, have meant that project is still pending in 2021. This was 16 years ago. Looking at our own cases, this isn't forest restoration involved, but I was just looking at our Solnex case earlier this morning. Next May, that'll be 40 years since the Longwell's oil and gas lease up in the Lewis and Clark National Forest was approved when they purchased it. They've now gone through 2 separate environmental impact statements, environmental assessment, more cultural inventories than I can count, and they're nowhere closer to getting their 4-acre exploratory well pad off the ground than they were 30 years ago. So it just shows like these are the types of problems you can run into when you try to do anything in national forest on federal land, this sort of stuff. And it grinds everything to a halt. between NEPA and the National Historic Preservation Act, the ESA, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. And that's not even getting into state level laws like you have in California, for example, with SECA. So I think that's the underlying problem is Congress is going to need to have to act on NEPA in order for us to make any real significant impacts on the wildfire problem going forward.
All these laws are really, they may, as Karen said, have served a noble purpose originally, but it's all an invitation to litigate too. I don't think we could ignore the role that litigation plays in all these things. I mean, almost every major forest decision today is litigated. You mentioned the case outside of Bozeman. I'm not super familiar with it, but I know there have been a couple others now that are going on 13 or 16 years. In some cases, because they've been litigated, and what these towns or people are trying to do is just protect their watersheds. This isn't just a forest issue, it's a watershed issue. When the forests burn and fall down, the mud gets into the reservoirs and silts things up. So there are a lot of ripple effects of forests beyond just the scorched earth impacts right there on the ground. So you've got communities across the West who are trying to build themselves defensible perimeters around their assets and around property and around homes. And in many cases, they're still being litigated. So is there anything we can do about the litigation explosion or the litigation obstruction that goes on?
Yeah, so I'm currently litigating multiple cases that the conflicts are older than I am. Been going through NEPA longer than I've been alive. So that just gives you something. I don't know. It's tough. It's a big fight. I think there's been some progress made, I think, with Congress providing more and more exemptions for the NEPA process, trying to work around it. You have a lot of kind of private-public partnerships working on shovel-ready projects that can kind of avoid the NEPA issue. People are coming up with clever workarounds, but that's what they are, they're workarounds, in my opinion.
Myron, you've been watching this issue for decades too. Give us your analysis of what various factors are, and address the elephant in the room. I mean, we often hear nowadays that climate change is the driver of all this. Climate change is the excuse. It's the explanation for everything. When I first started writing about this as a journalist in the late 90s and early 2000s, climate change hadn't become the default excuse and explanation for anything. So the focus was on the forest management element of this problem. Then now a lot of people just throw up their hands and say, see, it's climate change. We can't do anything about it. How do you respond to that? You hear it all the time.
Well, I've been in DC here and with my legs halfway into the swamp for much longer than you or Karen or David or Joe. And I'm a little more cynical than Karen. I wouldn't give a speech on when good laws go bad. I would give a speech on when bad laws get worse. And Congress is totally unwilling to do anything about it, or the administration. Look, this crisis of having thickets instead of forests, which leads to catastrophic fires, is completely due to the policies promoted by a majority in Congress since the 1980s. There was 12 billion board feet cut in 1990. The spotted owl was listed in 91. As Joe said, they got down to 1 billion board feet. The Trump administration was trying to push that back up, but the legal thicket is now as thick as the forest thicket. Mm-hmm. And there is no way to solve this problem as long as an urban elite has a majority in Congress to pursue environmentally and economically destructive policies. And they're a disaster in the rural West where we have federal lands. The Organic Act of 1897 said that the forests are being reserved to protect and improve them, to protect watersheds, and to provide timber. Well, the Forest Service doesn't do any of that now. They're 0 out of 4. Mm-hmm. That's incredible. They can't even do one of the things that they're supposed to be doing. And now more than half their budget is firefighting. And they have more and more money to fight fires. And every year they do a poorer job of fighting fires. More and more obstacles to getting on a fire quickly and putting it out before it gets out of control. So this is a disaster. And what we've got with the current administration and the current chairman of the committees in Congress is to say, oh, well, there's nothing we can do because it's climate. Well, if it's, let's leave aside, I think that's preposterous. But even if it is climate, that's more reason for more intensive management. It means that the forests are under more stress and they need more logging, they need more thinning, they need more prescribed burns, they need quicker responses on fires. And yet President Biden goes out to California and says, well, there's nothing we can do, it's just climate. Well, that's a complete abdication of responsibility. And it's making it's destroying large parts of the rural West. And that will spread to other parts of the country too if we get 30 by 30 and we start blocking up lands in the Southeast and the Northeast and so on. So I think climate is just a complete, it's a phony excuse.
But we do see, and this comes from a questioner, I've got a question in front of me. We do seem to see, wildfires elsewhere across the world too. So, how do you, explain that? That suggests a global phenomenon.
Well, that's a good question. The fact is that if global warming is the cause, why is it that in the United States, virtually all of the catastrophic fires are on federal land? Forest Service, BLM, National Park. There are a lot of private forests, tribal forests, and state forests in the West. They have fires, but they are not having the high intensity fires, the catastrophic fires that we're having on federal land. So if climate is the ultimate cause, why is it only federal land that suffers from the cause? There are tribal forests in the Southwest and up in Montana that are well managed. They've had some fires, but they haven't had these fires that have scorched the soil 6 inches deep and sterilized everything, killed all the wildlife, all the endangered species. So if climate is the excuse, you're going to have to explain why private forests in the Southeast are not having these catastrophic fires.
Add on to what Myron just said really quick, is that even for the cases like, of course, there are certain natural causes that are called droughts and invasive bark beetles and stuff that are also contributing to this. But the policies that we have in place make combating those natural problems even harder. Because again, if it takes 2 to 4 to 10 to 20 years to get a project off the ground dealing with the beetle infestation, well, that's 10 years where the beetles are destroying the forest. So these are all working together on a big mess of awfulness here.
The other factor, at a time where we want, and it seems to be there's consensus that we need to get into these forests and manage them, we're also promoting policies. This is, by the way, Biden just announced this is National Wilderness Month, and wilderness is a great romantic word. I live in the West. I live in Colorado. I love the wilderness myself. I'm an outdoors person, but it does strike me as ironic that at the very time we need to get in to our public lands to actually more actively manage those lands, we've got more roadless areas. And roadless is just a de facto wilderness zone that this came up years ago where they took all the old forest roads out or closed the forest roads, creating de facto wilderness areas. Actually, it seems ironic to me that we're in a mode of saying we need to get in and do more, and yet we're trying to build more barriers to the access that we need. Anybody want to comment on that? Joe, you've been part of this whole thing for years.
Sure, and thank you, Sean. The roadless rule is a legacy of the Clintonistas, again, not very friendly to federal forestry whatsoever, it is a big, as you say, it is de facto wilderness, and the permissions, the approvals to actually actively manage the roadless areas of the United States Forest Service, which almost total the land area of Oklahoma, which is about 45 million acres. That's a lot of land that is ready to burn. And so, that's a crazy policy. It's like one policy going against another. Oh, we need to do more in the forest, but we have all these roadblocks, these regulations. And I would like to just jump back to the question about, is it global warming and we have fires across the world? But the United States, North America is not unique in that some of its forests are fire derived. There are fire derived forests in Alaska, Siberia, Spain, Italy, Greece, Turkey, and even our friends in Israel are finding problems with forest fires because these are all these forests, these dry forests. End up being managed by fire in the absence of humans. But when humans are present and so forth, then it becomes a real big threat. Our eastern deciduous forest, much more moisture, but even our eastern deciduous forest at some point in time will burn. Every forest will burn, but we're not seeing the big fires like Myron pointed out in the south of the United States, where there's a lot of forestry that goes on, and they use a lot of burning, prescribed burning, but we don't see those big fires that we're doing here in the West. And Myron, I think, has hit it. It's unique to the federal system.
Prescribed burning, Joe, is just basically going out and proactively burning forests with smaller, less intense fires as a way to knocking down the fuels that will hopefully immunize those forests against some of the big burns. Just for people who don't know what prescribed burning is, we've got a few more minutes of moderated before we're going to open it up to Q&A. Please submit your Q&A anytime you want. We'll get to those very shortly, and it's a big topic. So, and I said we'd try to take it chronologically. So we're in another summer season. We're in another panic. Oh my God, it's a crisis. And there's a lot of money and proposals out there being thrown around about what to do with it. Anyone who wants to talk about what they're seeing out there in the landscape now, as far as whether any of these solutions that we hear about, paying firefighters more, putting more money into the Forest Service budget, and so on, whether these things are going to work given the other regulatory and legal factors that are all sort of conspiring to paralyze what we're doing here. Is anything on the horizon going to work?
Well, this is Karen, and I think that one of the problems we have is that these agencies are paralyzed by litigation. And I think part of the paralyzation comes because the federal government pays environmental groups to sue the federal government to stop programs.
Right. You
have, for example, the Endangered Species Act that has its own cause of action, so that if the Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries Service doesn't list a species, then they can be sued under the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act has got such strict regulatory timelines that if Fish and Wildlife Service misses a deadline, they can be sued by the environmental groups, and their attorney's fees get paid for simply missing a deadline. And so I started tracking the amount of litigation and petitions under the various administrations, and it just fascinates me that you get more petitions for listing of threatened or endangered species under Democrat administrations than you do Republican administrations.
Interesting.
And I think that probably it's because these groups figure out that they're going to overwhelm the system, then they get attorney fees, and then you get agencies rushing through and trying to just list stuff just so they don't get sued.
And Karen,
and I think it's so tied back to attorney's fees. If you look at the Equal Access to Justice Act, which is the attorney's fees you get for suing under NEPA, I think that's a huge incentive. And I think that's what stops a lot of work. I mean, I understand what people are saying about, oh, this is the original purpose of the act, and this is how the Forest Service is supposed to act. I totally agree with all that. But you've got a Supreme Court out there that has made these rulings, and you've got these groups just suing over and over and over on National Environmental Policy Act, or whether the Forest Service can be mandated for multiple use, or whether the federal government can own other federal lands except military bases and post offices. And that may not be what the Constitution or the Congress has said, but the Supreme Court says you can do it. And so you've got this huge cycle of litigation. Let's pay their attorney's fees. Litigation, let's pay their attorney's fees. And I think that's a huge driver in our policies, because people just simply don't want to get sued. But if you pay groups money to sue them, they're going to keep doing it.
Well, I think that, this is a little bit of fairly, to me, recent history, but it shows you how difficult this is. In 2004, we had the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, which was a bipartisan effort to get a hold of this program. And one of the elements of that act was the use of what they call categorical exclusions, which allow you somewhat to cut through some of this red tape to take care of these things. Now, as I understand it, and anyone who wants to correct me can, the Sierra Club and a few other groups went to court, and they basically eviscerated that key component of a law. Again, this was 2004. We could have been way ahead on this right now. We could have been on top of the problem, but basically that law was gutted, as I understand it, and digging us deeper into this hole. Is that your understanding or memory of what happened in 2004 with the Healthy Forest Restoration Act?
Yes,
well,
but
that is. Go ahead, Myron.
Well, look, the Healthy Forest Restoration Act was. It got smaller and smaller as it went along, because so at the end it wasn't going to solve the problem when it was passed. It was going to do a small amount of forest management in a few places, and even that was gutted by the court decision. So you're right. Yeah. But look, what we need first to get under control right now, we're not going to get through all this legal thicket anytime soon, because Congress doesn't have the will. And the administration is opposed to it. They're for letting it burn and just blaming it on climate. And many, Chairman Grijalva of the House Natural Resources Committee, that's fine with him. Mm-hmm. So I think what we have to do is initially we have to have some counties and states stand up and say, you have to let us take over. You have to let state crews and private companies and just ranchers and loggers go out and stop these fires. Yeah. Because these fires start and they're so slow in responding, and I believe this is intentional. They're the BLM and the Forest Service both. They're so slow in responding that they get out of control. States and counties should. They're quick. I mean, and private individuals are quick, but the federal government is very slow. So just next year, they ought to start empowering people to put out these fires. Then we ought to talk about pilot projects so that counties can take over the management of some of these areas and let them try it and see if they can do a better job. If the people who actually live there and know something about the land, and consulting local experts like Joe Reddan out in Durango, who've actually got a lifetime of experience and don't have all the federal obstacles, and say, this county can take over this national forest for 20 years, and let's see whether they do a better job.
Yeah.
Let me segue right now to we're starting to get some questions. We've got some questions here. So let me read it. Let's start into that phase of things now. This one says, it's my understanding that there is a purposeful destruction of logging roads by eco rules, making it impossible for firefighters to get in and out safely. Why is this not being stopped? And I guess that opens the door to a quick discussion about the rules of engagement in terms of how we fight fires. I know there have been a lot of criticism out in the far west in California this year about what is perceived to be a reluctance to engage in fire. I mean, on one hand, we're talking about, we've had a long history of suppression. Now we're talking about a failure to engage. Where are we on the firefighting regime in terms of how we engage on these issues? And what about the access and the roads? What role do they play?
Big part of the problem here is that there's just no one left to maintain the roads. Who do you think made the roads in the first place? There were logging companies and other private landholders and stakeholders out on the forest. And as those people have been systematically taken out, the government has allowed the roads to fall apart, sometimes with a little bit of encouragement, sometimes just out of negligence. But I think that's a big part of it, is just the destruction of the industry, destruction of the private stakeholders out there means that there's no one really left with an interest in maintaining anything.
David, this is Joe. Let me follow on what you're saying. True, road neglect is a big problem, but there also is a roads rule. There's a roadless rule and there's a roads rule. And many roads have been closed in the National Forest System under this roads rule. And basically the roads rule standard is about 1 mile of road per square mile. So every 640 acres, you would have a mile of road, right? But prior to that roads rule, there was, maybe 5 or 6 miles per road. Now, 640 acres is a lot to get around when you're trying to fight a fire. And one friend of mine, just on the Mount Hood National Forest, 5 years earlier, they closed some roads and they couldn't get into this logging operation. And so they had to hire helicopters. You know how expensive helicopter logging is compared to, loading logs on a truck, but that's the kind of insane things that happen when you have just a myriad of rules and people want to follow this rule, but they don't want to follow that rule. So it's a combination of things. And I will say that roads, okay, going from Myron's office in Washington, D.C., all the way out to Enlick Mesa near my house in Durango, okay, they are all public roads and those roads, like you said, were built by loggers. They are public assets. They are public infrastructure assets, and we are just letting them go. We're not maintaining them. We're closing them and so forth. It's crazy. It hinders forest management. But just to let you know,
could I add one thing to what Joe has said? Just let me give you one example from my part of the world in Eastern Oregon, the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest. From the 1960s until about 5 years ago, the Forest Service had intentionally closed about half the roads in the national forests, in the Wallowa-Whitman. Now, some of that may have been justified. It was a very active gold mining area, and there were just a lot of mining roads in places that probably didn't need roads. But a new forest supervisor came in, and she immediately said that we're going to close half the roads that are still open. There was such a public outcry that even the Democratic senator from Oregon, Ron Wyden, who was I think he was chairman of the committee at the time, or the ranking member, he actually came to Eastern Oregon, where he gets no votes at all. And there was such a public outcry at closing these roads that he actually, she was reassigned, I think, the next week after he came in to listen to the locals. So, this is a big issue, because access is important not only for fighting fires, it's important for the people who live there for recreation, hunting, camping, all kinds of stuff.
Livestock operations.
Livestock, absolutely.
Right. This is a hot topic, literally and figuratively. Let me get to another question, and I'll paraphrase it sort of. Isn't part of the problem here that the Congress has abdicated its responsibility in all this and just handed it over to the executive branch and the bureaucrats who run it? So they're basically implementing all these laws, and no one in Congress is going in to really countermand what's going on. It often seems to me, as someone who's watched this issue over time, that really, even the executive branch doesn't have total control. It seems to me often that all these management decisions are made by litigants, often environmental groups, and federal judges, and they have their pet judges that they go to across the West that they know they're going to get a good deal from, and that's who's really setting forest policy, is 10 federal judges across the West and the litigants who run to them to get what they want in these conflicts.
Well, this is Karen, and I think that is absolutely correct. For example, let me give you a really recent example dealing with the Clean Water Act rules that Trump did. So you had the case brought initially, Trump did his Clean Water Act rules only over what was the water of the US. The environmentalists hated it. One sued in the federal district court for the District of Colorado. They won in the district court. They requested an injunction to stop implementation of the Trump rules. The case went to the 10th Circuit, and the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals said, we don't have the jurisdiction to stop the implementation of the rules. If EPA wants to do new rules, they have to go through an entire rulemaking procedure, follow the process, involve the public, et cetera, et cetera. So they didn't like the 10th Circuit decision. Another group of environmentalists went running down to the district court in Arizona. The Arizona judge said, I have jurisdiction. And oh, by the way, I'm going to stop the implementation of the Trump rules, not just in Arizona where I have jurisdiction, but throughout the nation. And so she issued a nationwide injunction of the Trump rules. That's it. My husband and I used to laugh all the time. You always sort of figured out which parent you wanted to ask what question to so that you could get a yes. That is exactly what is happening. And so the Supreme Court has been fairly critical of the ability of these judges to like suck in jurisdiction from places they don't even have and then issue these nationwide injunctions. And I think that is one of the problems, because you're exactly right. There's 5 or 10 judges in the US that you know are going to side with the environmental groups every single time. That's who they pick. A lot of them are in the 9th Circuit because the 9th Circuit is in San Francisco. And so, let's ask, if I want a yes, let's ask Dad, because he's going to give us a yes on this and we know which one to ask. That's a process that only the Supreme Court's going to be able to stop. And I hope that this Supreme Court will take that up and stop that kind of
but Karen,
forum shopping.
Karen, look, this is ultimately all Congress's fault. The questioner is correct. Congress is at fault. They are totally dysfunctional. They have created this mess and they are unwilling to do anything to improve it. And we see this even when the Republicans are in charge. The steps that they take are just tiny little baby steps because of this huge kind of urban environmental imperialistic power that governs environmental policy in this country. So it's Congress. Congress is responsible for every one of the things that you have brought up.
And I don't disagree. Congress is the most dysfunctional body ever, but I think that part of it though is forum shopping and judges. And if we stop paying these environmental groups to sue the federal government, I think that would help as well.
It would, but only Congress can fix that problem.
That I would agree with.
Yes.
There are so many ironies out there and so much information to share. I mean, we just had a lumber shortage crisis that drove the cost of lumber up, which drives the cost of home building and stuff. And we have a lumber-rich country that imports logs from Canada and other places. So there's so many ironies here. But if I'm going to wrap this up by the top of the hour and give everybody sort of a parting statement, I think we need to start that now, unfortunately, because it's a great topic and I love it and we could go on and on. So why don't we just talk about, let's look forward. We've talked a lot about the past. We know that there's an untenable situation right now. Why don't we start with you, Myron? I really was intrigued with your idea of local or state control and states taking more of the control of this. They're the ones who suffer when massive fires break out and their homes are destroyed. How would that work? And could it work given kind of Washington's desire for power and to have it all?
Yes. Well, I've been watching this both, growing up in the Intermountain West with lots of BLM and Forest Service land and watching the kinds of mismanagement over the decades. And now for many decades, I've seen it, here at a more theoretical level in terms of how Congress and the administration works. I have concluded that really the only solution to the environmental and economic destruction of the federal lands west is to defederalize large parts of the West. We need a lot less federal land. We need a lot more local control. Now, there are ways of doing that. One is to just simply take federal land and sell it off to private individuals. In many cases in the desert, it would be grazing permittees. The other way is to transfer land to the states. Well, that's a heavy lift too. In the meantime, while we're working on these bigger projects to defederalize the West, I would go back to what I suggested. If counties and states would come forward and tell Congress, look, you are completely incompetent at managing this land. It's destroying our state's environment and harming our economy. Let us try it for a while. Give us a 10-year test run, and we'll see if we can manage this particular forest or this particular BLM district better than the feds can. I think, I'm pretty sure that they can. Now,
I agree.
Maybe not every experiment will turn out. Maybe some counties will be incompetent. Maybe some states will be incompetent. But I think on the whole, we'll have a better outcome environmentally and economically in the rural West.
Interesting. Joe, do you want to go next in terms of your wrap up?
Sure. Yeah. My wrap up would be to follow up on what Myron says. We already have an act. It's called Good Neighbor Act. It does have some poison pills in it, but it basically allows state agencies to cooperatively manage timber sales on the forest. And I think that Good Neighbor Act should be actually expanded. And legendary Good Neighbor Act, supposedly Doug Crandall drew it out on a cocktail napkin in some bar in Washington, D.C. But anyway, the Good Neighbor Act should be expanded to actually give a piece of control of a national forest or a BLM unit to a county, to a local jurisdiction. And then, you can do reports to Congress, et cetera, like Myron was saying, and see who does better, because I think the local control will do better.
Interesting. How about you, David? What would you say going forward when you look forward toward solutions?
Yeah, so I mean, as a libertarian hammer, like my nail is always going to be sell all the land to private people, let the states and the private people do it. That would be the right answer.
You're going to get some hate mail.
I think ultimately, I definitely agree with what Myron and Joe have already said. And then I would also kind of repeat some of the stuff that Karen was talking about a little bit earlier, where in addition to localism, we need a reform of these environmental statutes. So we need reform on the way that plaintiffs can get massive attorney's fees awards out of the government with the sue and settle issue. We need to perhaps limit the amount of time that protesters can file protests and lawsuits over these sorts of things, limit maybe the types of environmentalist organizations that can assert standing in these sorts of situations. I think there's a lot of stuff there that we can do to kind of cut back on the red tape that it can allow state, local, and enterprising administration officials to solve these problems. But I think we're going to need legal reform sooner rather than later.
How about you, Karen, to wrap it up?
Hey, I hate to disagree with my esteemed panelists, but every one of you mentioned something that Congress has to do. There is no legal mechanism that across the board you can transfer federal lands into private hands. Congress has to do something about that. Congress has to deal with attorney's fees, although I would really hope that you guys are good enough lobbyists to get Congress to do it, I'm not holding my breath. I think right now with the Supreme Court we've got a shot at dealing with some of these environmental laws through litigation. And I know litigation is expensive and it takes a while, but the Supreme Court is already complaining with the makeup that Trump has, unless Joe Biden can now pack the court, which when Republicans get in office, we'll just repack the court, so that I don't know that he can get it done. But I think the court is willing to look at this phenomenon of nationwide injunctions so that you don't have one little favorite district judge stopping regulations for an entire nation. I think the court they've already taken one case on the whole idea of deference to the federal agencies, and they've cut back on that. I think that a lot of what you guys are talking about is, federal agencies, or excuse me, that the courts just assume the federal government is right when it interprets regulations, but we've seen some of that come back with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in the Weyerhaeuser case, which was the Dusky Gopher Frog case, that was a great win for conservatives because they actually gave us now standing to sue over whether economics are considered in a critical habitat designation. I think that that's helpful. And I think the makeup of the Supreme Court now, in addition to lobbying, which I am totally all in favor of, just don't ask me to do it because Congress makes me crazy. I think that we need to be looking at the court system, and we now have a Supreme Court that might actually help us. And I think we need to not ignore that.
Excellent wrap-ups by all the panelists. Thank you again for your time. We bit off a huge topic today and just scratched the surface. Maybe we'll do another one as we go along. Thank you again for all the participants. Thank you also for your great questions today and all those who tuned in to this. If you want to learn more about what Mountain States Legal Foundation does, the legal cases we take, and the great clients that we fight for on behalf of their property rights, their grazing rights, and other rights, please go to mslegal.org. That's our website. We'd like you to visit that. We also have publications and newsletters and so on. But for now, we're going to have to wrap it up. So I want to, again, thank our esteemed panel for participating today. It was a great discussion. And maybe we'll continue the discussion later, hopefully, because this issue has been around for 30 years and it's not going to go away next year or this year. So thank you all for participating. It's been great. And thank you, audience, for tuning in.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you.